The sun hung low over the Arizona desert that afternoon, casting long shadows across the dusty ranch road where Samuel Henderson had been riding for the better part of 3 hours, and his thoughts were as scattered as the tumbleweeds rolling past. His horse's hooves. He was a man of 58 years now, with weathered hands and a face that told stories of decades spent under an unforgiving sun, and he had seen much in his life. But nothing quite prepared him for what he was about to encounter on that lonely stretch between town and his ranch. The figure appeared first as a dark shape against the golden grass, and Samuel squinted, thinking perhaps it was a coyote, or maybe just his aging eyes playing tricks on him again. But as he drew closer, his heart began to beat faster because this was no animal. It was a person crumpled on the ground beside the road, and even from a distance he could see something was terribly wrong. Samuel urged his horse forward and dismounted quickly, his boots hitting the hard earth with a thud, and he approached carefully, not knowing what he might find, and when he got close enough to see clearly, his breath caught in his throat. It was a young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, and she was in a bad way. Indeed, and her clothes were torn and dusty, and there was blood on her dress, and her face was pale as milk, and her breathing came in shallow gasps. "Miss," Samuel called out gently, kneeling beside her. "Miss, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, and they were filled with such fear and pain that Samuel felt his chest tighten, and she tried to speak, but only a whisper came out, and he leaned closer to hear. "Please," she managed to say. "Please help me." "I'm going to help you," Samuel said in the calm voice he used with frightened horses. "But I need to see where you're hurt, and can you tell me what happened?" She shook her head weakly, and tears began to roll down her dirt-streaked cheeks, and Samuel could see now that she had wrapped something around her leg, and the cloth was soaked through with blood. "Your leg," he said. "Something's happened to your leg, and I need to see it to help you." She looked up at him with those frightened eyes and asked in a voice barely above a whisper, "Take the cloth off." Samuel nodded gently. "Yes, miss, I need to take the cloth off to see how bad it is, and I know it might hurt, but I've doctored plenty of animals and people too over the years, and I'll be as gentle as I can." She nodded slightly, giving her permission, and Samuel reached for the makeshift bandage with careful hands, and his fingers worked at the knot she had tied, and he could feel her trembling beneath his touch. "What's your name?" he asked, trying to distract her as he worked. "Margaret." She whispered, "Margaret Clare." "That's a lovely name," Samuel said. "I'm Samuel Henderson, and my ranch is just about 5 miles from here, and we're going to get you there and get you proper help." He began to unwrap the cloth slowly and carefully, and with each layer he removed, his concern grew deeper, and finally the last piece came away, and Samuel looked down at what lay beneath, and he stood there frozen, unable to move or speak. Horror washed over him like a cold wave, because what he saw was worse than he could have imagined, and the wound was deep and ugly and clearly from some kind of animal attack, and the flesh was torn badly, and he could see it was already showing signs of infection. But it wasn't just the severity of the wound that made Samuel's blood run cold, and it was something else entirely, and something that spoke of neglect and suffering beyond just this injury. Margaret's leg bore the marks of old scars too, and burns that had long since healed, and bruises in various stages of fading. And this young woman had been hurt many times before, and not by accident. Samuel's hands began to shake, and not from fear of the wound itself, but from the rage and sorrow building in his chest at what another human being must have done to this girl who did this to you. He asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Who's been hurting you, Margaret?" She turned her face away, and fresh tears streamed down, and she didn't answer, but she didn't need to, and Samuel had seen enough cruelty in his years to know the signs of prolonged abuse. He took a deep breath and pushed his anger down deep where it couldn't cloud his judgment. And right now, this girl needed help, not his fury. "Listen to me, Margaret," he said firmly but kindly. "I'm going to bind this up proper, and then I'm going to get you on my horse, and we're going to my ranch and my wife Dorothy. She's got healing hands, and we're going to take care of you, and nobody's going to hurt you anymore, and do you understand me?" She looked at him then with such desperate hope in her eyes that it nearly broke his heart, and she nodded. Samuel worked quickly, using clean cloth from his saddlebag to wrap her leg properly, and he was as gentle as he could be, but he knew it must have. Hurt terribly, and Margaret bit her lip but didn't cry out. Getting her onto the horse was harder, and she was weak from blood loss and shock. But Samuel was still strong despite his years, and he managed to lift her up and then climbed on behind her and held her steady. As they began the slow journey to his ranch, Margaret drifted in and out of consciousness during the ride, and Samuel kept talking to her softly, telling her about his ranch and his wife and how they'd raised 3 children there, though they were all grown now with families of their own. "Dorothy and I have been married 37 years, he said, and she's the best woman I've ever known, and tough too, and she grew up on a ranch herself, and she knows how to handle just about anything, and you'll like her, Margaret, and she'll take good care of you." The sun was setting when they finally reached the ranch house, and Dorothy must have seen them coming because she was already standing on the porch, and one look at Samuel's face told her something serious had happened. "Dorothy." Samuel called out, "Get the spare room ready and bring hot water and clean bandages, and she's hurt bad." Dorothy didn't waste time with questions, and she hurried inside, and by the time Samuel had carried Margaret into the house, Dorothy had everything prepared. They laid Margaret on the bed in the spare room, and Dorothy took one look at the girl's injuries, and her face grew stern, but her hands remained gentle as she began to clean and dress the wounds properly. "Samuel," Dorothy said quietly, "go make some strong tea and add honey and bring it here." He did as she asked, and when he returned, Dorothy was sitting beside Margaret, stroking her hair back from her forehead, and Margaret was crying softly. "It's all right, dear," Dorothy was saying. "You're safe now, and we're going to take care of you, and you don't have to tell us anything until you're ready." Over the next few days, Margaret slowly began to heal, and her leg was badly injured, but Dorothy's careful nursing kept the infection from spreading, and gradually color returned to Margaret's cheeks, and she was able to sit up and take solid food. Samuel and Dorothy didn't press her for information, and they simply cared for her and made her feel safe. And Samuel noticed how she flinched at sudden movements and how she always seemed to be listening for something. On the 4th day, Margaret finally began to talk. She told them about her father who drank heavily and beat her and her mother who had died 2 years ago, leaving Margaret alone with him, and how he'd gotten worse after her mother's death, and how he blamed Margaret for everything wrong in his life. She told them about trying to run away 3 days ago, and how he'd come after her on horseback, and how when he caught up to her there had been a struggle, and she'd fallen, and his horse had reared and its hoof had caught her leg. "He just left me there," Margaret said, her voice hollow. "He looked down at me bleeding on the ground, and he said I'd gotten what I deserved, and then he rode away." Dorothy's eyes filled with tears, and she wrapped her arms around Margaret and held her tight, and Samuel had to leave the room because the anger in him was so fierce he was afraid of what he might do. That evening, after Margaret had fallen asleep, Samuel and Dorothy sat together on the porch as they had done thousands of times before. "We can't send her back," Dorothy said quietly. "No," Samuel agreed. "We can't. Her father will come looking for her eventually." "Let him come," Samuel said, and there was steel in his voice. "He won't take her." Dorothy reached over and took his hand. "We're not young anymore, Samuel, and we've raised our children, and we've earned our rest, and are you sure you want to take this on?" Samuel looked at his wife and saw the same determination in her eyes that he felt in his heart, and he squeezed her hand. "I'm sure," he said. "When I saw what he'd done to her, Dorothy. When I took that cloth off and saw all those old injuries, all that suffering, and I knew right then that I couldn't turn away. And some things are more important than rest." Dorothy nodded and smiled, and they sat together in the gathering darkness. Margaret stayed, and at first she was skittish and uncertain, always expecting to be sent away or hurt, but Samuel and Dorothy were patient, and they gave her space when she needed it, and comfort when she asked for it. Samuel taught her to ride properly, and to care for the horses, and he showed her how to mend fences and check water troughs, and Margaret took to the work eagerly as if grateful to be useful. Dorothy taught her to cook and sew and tend the garden, and in the evenings they would all sit together and talk or read or simply enjoy the quiet companionship. 6 weeks after Margaret arrived, her father showed up. Samuel saw him coming up the road, and he recognized the man from Margaret's description, and big and rough-looking and sitting his horse like he owned the world. Dorothy sent Margaret inside and stood beside Samuel on the porch. "You got my daughter here," the man called out without even dismounting. "I've got a young woman here who nearly..."